My sister-in-law kicked me out. Over $2,000. 10 years later, that same house went up for sale. Owned by me. She threw my suitcase onto the porch over a $2,000 debt I didn't even owe her, and told me never to come back. 10 years later, she needed my signature to sell that same house. If you like stories where patience turns into power, hit subscribe, because this one took a decade to pay off. My name is Hannah. I was 23 when my parents died in a car accident 8 months apart from each other's funerals, leaving me and my older brother Peter as each other's only real family. Peter was steady, quiet, the kind of brother who showed up with groceries when he noticed you hadn't left your apartment in days. He inherited our parents' modest 3-bedroom house, and since I was still finishing my accounting degree and barely scraping by on a part-time job, he told me I could live there with him for as long as I needed. I loved that house. It smelled like our mother's cooking, even years after she was gone. Then Peter married Vanessa. Vanessa was polished in a way that made me feel underdressed just standing next to her. Tailored blazers, a laugh that carried across a room, always quick with a compliment that somehow felt like an insult. My best friend since high school, Grace, met her once at Peter's engagement party and pulled me into the bathroom afterward. "She asked me twice how much the house was worth," Grace said, "before she even asked your brother's middle name." I laughed and told Grace she was being paranoid. Grace wasn't paranoid. Grace was right about almost everything, eventually. The first year of the marriage was fine, even pleasant. Vanessa redecorated, hosted dinner parties, seemed genuinely fond of Peter. But slowly, the house started feeling less like mine and more like something I was borrowing. She started mentioning, almost casually, how nice it would be to have more space once she and Peter started a family. She'd sigh when she saw my shoes by the door. She reorganized the kitchen and didn't tell me where anything went. Small things, the kind that make you feel like a guest in your childhood home. Then Peter's construction business hit a rough patch. A client stiffed him on a $40,000 contract, and suddenly money was tight. Vanessa handled the household finances, and one afternoon she came to me with a printed spreadsheet explaining that I owed $2,000 in back rent and utilities from the past year. Money she said I'd agreed to pay Peter directly but never had, despite the fact that Peter had told me repeatedly I didn't need to pay anything at all. When I told her that wasn't true, she got sharp, cold, said I was taking advantage of Peter's kindness, and that some of us actually contribute to this household. Peter was on a job site out of state for 3 weeks during all of this and had no idea any of it was happening. I offered to pay what I could, about $600 I'd saved from my part-time bookkeeping job. She refused it, said it was too little too late, and that afternoon, while I was at class, she packed my things into 2 suitcases and left them on the porch. When I came home, the locks had already been changed. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, and told me I had worn out my welcome and that it was time I figured out how to be an adult. I stood on that porch, 24 years old, holding everything I owned in 2 suitcases, staring at the house my parents raised me in. Peter called me in tears when he found out 3 weeks later, furious at Vanessa, apologizing over and over. But he'd just signed a new business loan using the house as collateral, Vanessa's idea, and he told me, quietly, that things were complicated now, that fixing it wasn't as simple as it should have been. The apology lasted about 2 phone calls. Then the calls got shorter, then quieter, then, eventually, mostly silent. filled with excuses about how busy things were. I moved in with Grace for 8 months while I finished my degree, sleeping on a pull-out couch, working 2 jobs, promising myself I would never again depend on anyone else's goodwill for a roof over my head. Grace never once made me feel like a burden. She helped me study for my CPA exam at her kitchen table, night after night, coffee going cold between us. I passed the exam. I got a job at a mid-sized accounting firm, then a better one. Then, 6 years after that porch, I started my own small financial consulting practice, specializing in real estate investment, a field I'd fallen into almost by accident, chasing the kind of security nobody could take away from me with a change of locks. Here's the ticking clock. 9.5 years after I stood on that porch with 2 suitcases, Peter called to tell me his construction business had finally, quietly, been struggling for years under debt Vanessa had convinced him to take on for investments she'd made without fully explaining to him. They needed to sell the house, our parents' house, to cover what they owed. He sounded exhausted in a way I'd never heard before. While helping Peter untangle the mess as a favor, purely as his sister doing what sisters do, I started reviewing the property records and financial documents he forwarded me. That's when I found it. A small clue tucked into a scanned bank statement Vanessa had accidentally included in the file. A separate account, opened 4 years earlier, with over $80,000 funneled into it slowly over time. Money that had clearly come from the business accounts Peter thought were struggling honestly. I didn't say anything to Peter right away. I called Grace instead, and together, over 2 long nights, we traced the transfers, cross-referenced dates, and built a clear picture. Vanessa had been quietly draining the business for years while blaming its collapse on bad luck and the economy, all while telling Peter they had no choice but to sell his childhood home. I brought everything to Peter gently, sitting across from him at Grace's kitchen table, the same table where I'd once studied for my CPA exam. He went pale, then silent, then finally, angry in a way I'd never seen from my calm, steady brother. That same week, Vanessa, sensing something had shifted, made her last mistake. She called me directly, sweet as ever, asking if I'd be willing to help broker the house sale, since I was so good with real estate now. Clearly hoping to use my expertise without knowing I already had the full financial picture. I told her I'd be happy to help. I just didn't tell her how. Working with Peter, and with a real estate attorney Grace connected me with, I quietly arranged to purchase the house myself through my consulting practice at fair market value, using savings and investments I'd built over a decade of never again wanting to depend on someone else's mercy. Because of the debt structure and the fraud documentation Peter and I compiled, Vanessa's hidden account became evidence in the divorce Peter filed 3 weeks later, once he'd seen enough. The court awarded him a significant portion of those hidden funds as marital assets improperly concealed, and Vanessa walked away from the marriage with a fraction of what she thought she'd secured, along with a reputation among their social circle that never quite recovered once people learned why the marriage really ended. The day the sale closed, I stood on that same porch again, 10 years almost to the month since she'd left my suitcases there. This time, I had the keys in my hand. Peter cried when I handed him a spare set, told him he'd always have a place there, that the house was staying in the family the way our parents would have wanted. Vanessa found out I was the buyer 3 days after closing, when the paperwork became public record. Grace told me she actually called Peter, furious, asking how his broke little sister had bought a house in cash. Peter, for the first time in years, didn't defend her. He just told her the truth. I was never broke. I was patient. I still run my consulting firm. Peter lives in our parents' house again, this time with a lease agreement I insisted on, just so nothing like that could ever happen to either of us the same way twice. And every time I visit for Sunday dinner, I sit on that same porch where I once stood holding 2 suitcases, and I let myself feel, fully, exactly how far I've come. If this story gave you chills, hit subscribe, because next week I'm telling you about the woman who let her fiancé's family plan an entire $1 million wedding without telling them she'd already canceled the venue 3 weeks earlier.